So let's get underway. We'll learn a little bit about the Haggadah, and you'll have it here in a minute. First of all, we have a lot of things that we do in Judaism that involve getting together in groups, and we never open with a table of contents. And what I'm trying to do this year, because every year I try to mix it up a little bit, I called this series, the Behind the Songs of Freedom. We have certain songs that we sing at the Seder that are, you could say, staples. They may be different tunes, but they're staples that you find them at almost every Seder. You hear about them. So I thought, okay, I'll focus this year on like the songs because you can introduce, oh, before we do this song, probably not a great idea to try to do an introduction to the first song because we're anxious. Let's get rolling. But you have time maybe before, since you can't start the Seder on either night until some period of time after the previous day has concluded, which is its own halachic discussion, which we'll go to another time. But we never do a table of contents. And for some reason, at the very beginning of the Haggadah, just to point this out, it's an elemental piece, right? Every Haggadah opens with the simanim. And you think, well, that's a publisher's decision. Some guy decided it would be nice to put a table of contents. But no, actually, as early as the Machzor Vitri. The Machzor Vitri is a work that is from the base medrash of Rashi. So when Rashi died in 1105, he had many, many students. He had a yeshiva. So among those students was Rabbeinu Simcha of Vitreux, and he wrote the Machzor Vitri. Vitri was the Hebrew way of saying Vitreux in France. And so he wrote a halacha compendium of practices of his Rebbe and Piskei Halacha that were never written down. This happens till today, right? Even with all of our technology. Today you'd say, oh, it was recorded that a rabbi said it, but they never wrote it in a sefer. But that's the first step, right? And indeed, in the Machzor Vitri, it mentions Bala Hasev Bebeito Teram Yochal Mikadosh Yain Ve'Ose Sidro Ketikun Rabotenu LaOlam LeYashana Misidro. You have to go in a certain seder, a certain order. Oh, excellent. So it's not exactly, that you have to have a printed text with a table of contents, but the point is there's something about the order and the sequencing that in and of itself is significant. Thank you so much. Is significant, and that is year over year, you're going to repeat it, even though at this stage of the game, I think most of us, you know what it's going to be. It's Kadesh Orchas, there's an order, but it seems that it's important to mention that order. And in our case, and many times, we sing about the order. And one of the Haggadahs, I didn't give you the source here. Some of the things, by the way, I give you a couple of sources. I don't want to overburden it, but you're welcome to take notes and you can speak about it your Seder. But just to think about, okay, we're starting with table of contents with Seder, with like making order here, and all the chaos is like there's going to be a sequence. By the by, you could have said, wouldn't it be nicer to have Kiddush, Hamotzi, everyone will start eating, we'll have an aperitif during the meal. Then, while we're serving the brisket, we'll tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. But that's not what happens, obviously. We know from, right, many, many years. And the story, which you're welcome to tell. Some of the stories are almost like songs because they have a quality to them. They can be retold and told and told every year. After a point, kids, people around the table, the kids, the grandchildren, I know they can tell a story. But that's one of the vehicles we have for transmission of our Masorah. See under Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. So the story Rabbi Nachman tells about these two beggars, a Jew and a non-Jew, and the non-Jew keeps saying to the Jew, I need to be invited to one of the Jewish homes. I understand the Jews have a big festival coming, a big meal. The Jew says to them, I could have you invited. I don't know that you're really gonna get anything out of it. To get anything out of it, it's gonna be an amazing meal. I always hear about it, this Seder that they have. So the Jew tells him, okay, I'm gonna arrange for you to go to a Seder, and he sets him up at a guy's house. And sure enough, they go to separate homes. The next day, first day Pesach, they're back on a park bench, and the non-Jew looks terrible. He's haggard. He looks terrible. The Jewish fellow says to him, what happened? He said, what happened? Ridiculous. I go to these people's house. They have a fine table. It looks amazing. These very apparently wealthy people, because I see they're all leaning at the table and they have all the finery out. I sit down, have a nice goblet of wine. I'm thinking this is going to be great. They give me a vegetable. They keep warning me, don't eat too much of it. I dip it in salt water. I'm a little thirsty. Nothing to drink. They're willing to give me some water. And they start telling a story. Okay, well, we understand. The Jews got to eat. So we keep going and going and going. I am famished. And the nerve of them, everyone goes to wash their hands a second time. I mean, how dirty could my hands have been from the first time? We come back to give us a flatbread. It had no taste. And then you won't believe what happened next. It was crazy. They tell me we have one more thing we have to eat before we get to the meal. And they give me this horseradish. And I see everyone's popping it in their mouth. And I put a big gulp in my mouth. He said I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed my seat back. I got up and I said, this is ridiculous. I have no interest. I'm leaving. I'm not waiting anymore. He was as I ran out. Says Rabbi Nachman, hold on a little longer. Hold on a little longer. There's a whole Seder over here. Maybe you're up to the part in the Seder where you're already very hungry, and maybe all that's coming is something that you can't even taste. And then something else is coming and it's going to be very, very bitter. Just hold on. A beautiful meal is coming. A Jew holds on and waits. It's a nice story, you know. So Kadesh Urchat is a certain Seder. It's nice, depending on the age and the level of sophistication of the people at your Seder. It's just a nice story. Rabbi Nachman Breslover. Yeah, so you can a great storyteller. I used to say the greatest storyteller is the Kodesh Baruch Hu. How do I know? Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'ha'aretz. He didn't start with the mitzvahs. He started first as the story. So story. That reminds me of in Inyan. I'm sure it was a very beautiful but an incredibly long Seder. Reb Chaim of Tzanz would begin the Seder each year with the story of creation. The story of creation. And he would tell the whole story. Now, how long did they actually have? Yeah. He'd go through the whole Jewish history till he got to the part where the Jews become slaves. Why did he do this? They say that he did so because the idea of fixing the first sin was a sin of speech, not getting things right. The snake, the serpent saying things about God that are incorrect, Chava being drawn in, and then eating. And the night of the Seder is fixing speech. There's a mitzvah of dibur, and it's fixing eating, where you have more mitzvot achila with brachot sitting one next to the other. So Reb Chaim Tzanz would begin there. Speaking of stories, again, how long was that Seder? I don't know. What were the kids doing the whole time? Could they wait that long? I don't know. Anyway, if you look here at the next source, that's the Machzor of Vitri, right? He doesn't tell you Kadesh Urchatz Karpas Yachats. The point is, but he says you should go sit down before you eat. You make Kiddush and you go according to the Seder that was set up by the sages. Don't go out of order. By the by, halachically, if a person was to sit down and eat first, it's questionable if they're kind of the mitzvot of the Seder, because there is a certain order that the storytelling is meant to be actually before the meal begins, a whole thing. Anyway, the Chatam Sofer here in the next source talks about the idea that maybe what we're dealing with here is something about the nations of the world and a story of the Jewish people, a national story that's being told. I'll actually put it on the screen here as well, just because. He writes here that Ofen Sheni, different interpretations, me Ofen Galiotenu, V'inyano be'olam hazeh, the issue of our exile and its matter in this world. Sha'ideze yitparsem shmo yitbarach ba'olam, v'gadol shmo b'goyim, al yedei hanisim she'ose imanu, eit ge'ulatenu. V'yedei zeh, zechut hagoyim talui banu, sheyavdu oto, Shchem Echad. The idea is that by having this order, there's a certain order to our national story. Our exile has an order, and it's playing out over time. And the idea that through the story of the Jewish people, including the exiles, plural, Chatam Sofer is already in the 19th century, but also including our redemption, certainly from Egypt, what would Chatam Sofer have said about Hakamat Medinat Yisrael? Question mark. Hard to know. Hard to know. He has followers who think one way, but I'm not so sure they're correct. So he says, the non-Jewish world realizes, their merit is connected to the Jewish nation. Halu et Hashem kol goyim. Say it in the Hallel, even at the night of the Seder. Everything that the whole world will come to recognize someday about the hand of God in Jewish history and narrowly speaking, but generally in all of world history, they'll come to it also. So we start, and we're setting a tone for the rest of the world, as it were, through what we are doing. Ki anu hagormin al derech hashma mesaprim ein omer rak b'chol haaretz yatsa kavam. So the heavens will tell the story, right? And there will be no speech from from others, but rather the music will come from the whole world. That's what it means. All the nations, all of the peoples will come to praise God and to sing songs of praise. שעל ידי זה מה שאמת השם לעולם שנתעמת אצל אנשי העולם הווה כאילו יאמר נא ישראל וכל התשבחות על שם ישראל נקראו. נמצא מה שמצרף אותנו על ידי אומות העולם טוב היא לפרסם שמו בעולם וזהו קדש ורחץ. And that's where we're coming to Kaddish Orchatz. In other words, what does he say? We, the Jewish people, are the trendsetters. We start with the night of the Seder, we're praising Hashem, and we even say that there will come a time when the nations of the world, Kol Goyim, Shabachu Kol all the peoples, will be able to also praise Hashem. Ki gavar leinu chasdo, we already see the way in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings his chesed for us. And, he will, ve'emet Hashem l'olam, that other nations of the world will also come to that authentication of acknowledging that what's happening with the Jewish people is the hand of God, and that by extension, the entire world is also under the providence of God. And that's what Kadesh Orchatz is. Meaning, says the Chassam Sofer, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kadesh Orchatz Otanu Al Yedei Karpas Yachatz. It's Drush. Yeah. So what does he mean? God will first sanctify us, all right? And he will, so to speak, wash us, means he will purify us, a certain sense of, what's the word? A catharsis that happens to us. We are refined through the nations of the world. Meaning, to say it more plainly, how does God sanctify us? Right now, that's actually through the fact that the nations of the world are putting us through the ringer. But someday they'll recognize that they were part of a story that was a much bigger story about the Jewish people. And that bigger story was a story, Davka, that was about Jewish history, that they were a part of. Yeah. And to have that acknowledgement and that awareness is coming. How does it happen? Through Karpas Yachatz. What is Karpas? So he writes in his earlier sources as well, that's the Parech. Karpas is the idea of Shishim Parech, the idea of the hard labor they put us through. Kadesh Urchatz, God sanctifies us through the putting us through the ringer, quote unquote, of purifying us through this suffering that we have to undergo through the hard labor. And what's the Yachatz? So Yachatz, he writes, is Roshei Tevot, Yoshvei Choshech Tzalmavet, those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. And why is that? V'hu Magid Rachza, Sheimshoch Harechitza Lezulatenu. It will tell the story about the story of the Jewish people's emergence from this having been washed in Kadesh Urchatz. First is what happens to us. Then comes Magid Rachza, those who can tell the story of understanding that we were, as it were, laundered or cleaned in some way as a result of this. And speak about it to others. V'amar motzi matzah, Kadosh Baruch Hu yistir schar olam haba. He'll take out the matzah. It keeps going. You don't have to go through every line of it, right? You could figure it out. Maror and korech, right? The bitterness, the korech, the being oppressed, right? Shulchan orech, there'll be a table that will come afterward that's organized, right? Tarach lafanai shulchan neged sorai. In other words, when you're hearing the cadences of the song, literally, it just refers to what's going to happen at the Seder. But the Chassam Sofer says is a template somehow for our recognition in coded language. And everything we're going through, including very challenging things, is actually all part of a much larger process. And there's a symbolic layer of understanding of each of these words that reads the Seder as the Seder of Jewish history. Again, it's not overt, right? Because the night's focus is really meant to be on Leil HaSeder of Yetziat Mitzrayim, but it becomes the template, as it were, for other things, because that until Hakamat Hamadina, you could say, that was the only template story we really had of exile and redemption that actually led to our not actually being subservient entirely to somebody else. I'm taking out Ba'it Sheni, the return in the Second Temple period, because to the extent that there was independence for a limited period of time, which the Rambam claims that there was for almost 200 years, it didn't end well. And right, and the internecine fighting of the Hasmonean dynasty and sad things that happened thereof, culminating in the Churban. So, right. But Baruch Hashem, we're back, and we're back in Medinat Israel. And I think it's important, especially this year. Last year was also very important. It's important every year, but especially with everything going on in Medinat Israel, to speak about the pain, to speak about the loss, and also about the amazing nisim that are ongoing. The very existence of Medinat Israel is ongoing. I didn't give you the source, but I found in one of the many likutim that I have, the anthologies. I just gave you the line, "You're looking for signs from Tiferet Ish Minsk." I don't even know who that is, by the way, to be honest, but it's quoted in one of in a Seder Ha'aruch that I have. The Simani HaSeder are a hint that the mitzvot halayla are simanim. That's why it's called Simani HaSeder, the signs, like you would put signs on a lost object. So many people come to the Seder, they're looking for simanim baderach. They want a path on the way. And here they come to an ordered, structured evening where everything follows one to the next. And the idea that there are simanim, signs. When you have a lost object, if someone finds a lost object, you want to retrieve it. You say, the person who found it says to you, "Do you have any simanim? Do you have any signs, that show that this is yours?" So this Haggadah, Tiferet Ish Minsk, says, these are our simanim. The Jew says, "I may be very lost, but I understand there's kiddush, there's four cups, there's a matzah, there's maror, there's a story to be told. I'm part of that story. It's the simanim." So we open with a simani haseder to remind everybody you have a siman here also. Yeah, you have 2 nights of Pesach, so you could use it on either night, or you talk about it at lunch or something. Because obviously you can't give 3 day Torah, and when you're at the simani haseder, people are giving you long looks like, "You doing this now?" Yeah, okay, you understand. Okay, so that's a few things there. One other thing that I saw, and it's kind of connecting to a later story in the later song, which we won't get to today, that's for sure, which is the Dayenu song, as it's known, Kama Malo Tovot. So there are 15 steps there, and here there are also 15 stages at the Seder, if you count them up. Motzi and matzah being separated, because motzi is making motzi, and matzah is the mitzvah of matzah. It's 2 separate things they're both being accomplished as 2 separate brachot on it too. So even though they make the brachas together, but it's really 2 different things. So the 15, so one of the Haggadahs in the Seder Leil Pesach, which seems like a rather generic name for a Haggadah, yeah, the Seder Leil Pesach Haggadah. Okay, but that was the name of it. It's a hint already here that on each one of these is Kama Malo Tovot Lamakom Aleinu, how many steps we have that we have to thank God for, and on each one that we can do, including the step of Maror. It's not the only one, it's not the major one. I mean, it's a major one, but it's sandwiched in, if you will, Maror and Korah in there. So that's one. Next, Halach Ma'anya. A lot of people have tunes for Halach Ma'anya. I gave here from the Haggadah Shel Pesach of the Ritva. So the Ritva writes, this is not actually in the Mishnah. That's why it's in Aramaic. He gives you 2 reasons, but and the first reason has to do with a complicated reason on so many levels. Claims that it's so that the Shadim will not come in because they don't know how to understand Aramaic. I don't really understand what that means. It seems the Ritva didn't really either, because he says there are those who say, but then he says V'anacho on the second line there in the Ritva, V'anacho lefi shezeh eino miseder hamishna el mitikun Amoraim. It came in the days of the Amoraim, which is a generation of sages after the sages called the Tanaim. As you know, we have generations of Jewish history, epochs or eras. They're all described for us as Jews against the backdrop of who the sages were at that time. So we have the sages of the Mishnah, also known as Tanaim, sages of the Gemara, known as the Amoraim. When the Talmud is finished and written and closed, then we have other sages, this Tkufa, the era of the Geonim, then the Rishonim, then the Achronim. We don't even know what our era is called now. If we're still in the era of the Achronim, it's debatable. I forgot an intermediate generation, the Rabbanan Sfarai. Won't go down that road right now. All to say, the language shift, we start not in Hebrew but in Aramaic, is to remind us this part was not from the Mishnah. But so much of our Haggadah is from the Mishnah. It's from an even earlier time. Mishnah was written in Hebrew. A Talmud, at least a part of it called Gemara, which is the commentary on the Mishnah, is really written in Aramaic. And it tells us, therefore, that it came later on in Jewish history. And the point of it, according to the Ritva, was because that was the lingua franca of people, and therefore they wanted to be in a language people would understand. The first language of exile of the Jewish people is Aramaic, right? We know that already from parts of the Tanakh. In other words, in the book of Ezra, chapters in Aramaic. In the book of Daniel, chapters in Aramaic. So why is that? Because the Jews were already either in or just returning from the first exile to Babylonia. That's what they knew. But this, according to the Ritva, is actually written later. And it's just to consider that when we look at and this reminds us, the Haggadah is a composite work. It's so simple to say, but we forget. We think there's like some, the book was written by one sage. They put it together like, here you go. No, there are different versions of it, and parts were built on it. And this reminds us something about you could say about the structure, if you will. I gave you later on here. I put you bookends against despair, Chesed Lavram. The beginning of the Seder is Halach Ma'anya Aramaic, and the end of the Seder, Chad Gadya Aramaic. So the bookends are, he says, bookends against despair. They're therefore both in Aramaic. In the one case, having an entry point, and also the exit point are, we know we're in exile, but we put that at the bookends to remind ourselves, okay, but even in that language, we can still keep going. Yeah. There's a famous literary critic whose name I won't mention at the moment for various reasons, but he famously said, he goes to a Jewish bookstore in America and he just can't get over what he sees. The Mishnah Berurah is in English. How about learning things and reading them in their primary language? How about that? What happened to Jewish literacy, meaning you have to learn Hebrew and read it? I mean, it was personally like a high standard, yeah? I'm not sure I agree with that. It's a highbrow way to be. The Haggadah starts in this Aramaic to tell you, wherever you're living, make sure you're translating what you're reading and singing into a language people understand. Not to give up on Hebrew, but yeah, and we're even willing to admit that, therefore, into the Haggadah. If you look at the Rambam actually writes, Nusach Haggadah shenago ba'isol bizman galut kachu. So he tells you the syntax or the version of the Haggadah that we have at the time of the exile is as such. So he says, you start with the second cup, and what do you say? Matchil al kos sheni v'omer b'bihili etzanu Mitzrayim halach ma'anya da'achalu avatanu ba'aradis the Mitzrayim, right? Kol dichvin. So in other words, it's all about the exile. That's why it's written that way. There's a Haggadah Masa Nisim found points out that a person might open with the idea, how could you have simcha? We're in galut. How could we have any simcha? We're in exile. The whole Seder is about redemption. Like, pretty far from that. You'll tell me, well, obviously it ends, L'shana b'Yerushalayim. That's true, but it's also part of exile that we're even saying that. And therefore, the very beginning is almost like a permission to be able to celebrate, again, in translation, if you will. That's why we speak in this Haggadah, Hashtahacha, it's the last line. Now we're here. L'shana haba be'arad Yisrael. It's in Halachman. Next year we'll be in Israel. For generations, Jews were saying that. Haggadah Masa Nisim didn't turn it in the Zionist, direction. But I would say, how do you like that? The Haggadah of exile says, now we're here, but by next year we could be in Israel. By next year. Not very likely in 1523 in Krakow. It's not very likely. Not very likely in 1746 in Prussia. It's just not likely. But every year, but by next year. Yeah. So we don't live like that anymore. Now we read it like technically, yeah, actually it could be, right? Worthy of consideration. So there you have it. So just the idea. So therefore it's like, okay, you know what? We have license to have some simcha here. And what's the simcha? That even when we're here, we're recalling, now we're here, but not by next year, things could be better. Odio Ter Tov. Speaking of another song, which is complicated for other reasons. We won't talk now about that. We mentioned L'shana haba, Be'arad Yisrael. And the Rashbats, you look here on the bottom of the page, it flows to the next page. For want of time, just look at the top of page 2. This is the Rashbats. Shimon ben Semach Duran, Middle Ages. What do you mean? It goes right to page 3? Yeah. She did a one-sided sheet. This is the auditory part of our presentation. Sorry, a comedy of errors. It's on me. I should have photocopied it yesterday. Ve'ein b'chol zot hapiska lashon hakodesh ki'im hashana haba'a b'nei chorin ki kein lashon hatinokot le'olam l'shana haba b'Yerushalayim uvnei chorin. The way of children, every kid at the Seder, says the Rashbats, knows how to say the words l'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. So we catch them l'shana haba, but instead of saying Yerushalayim, say ba'arad Yisrael. Ba'arad Yisrael is supposed to be Yerushalayim. At the end of the Seder, we'll get to Shana haba b'Yerushalayim. But here we're saying we just want to go to the land, of Israel, and the idea that right here, sort of, you could say like a baked in. That's how the kids talk. That's how people talk. They know l'shana haba. You don't expect to say ba'arad Yisrael. You're not expecting that. But the point is, okay, maybe we can't get to Yerushalayim. Maybe that's going to be a Beit Mikdash. Could we at least get to Eretz Yisrael? Rashbats. So did he know something we don't about, how the phases would work about going back to the land of Israel? Hard to know. Maybe, maybe not. Obviously he had Emunah. So do we. But here we are. So it's, the insertion of those two Hebrew words is sort of like, it's a play on Lashon Haba Yerushalayim, but that's like aiming very high. What's the expression? If you aim for the moon and you miss, you get the stars, or something like that. It's a nice idea. So I don't think he knew that adage either. Rav Elchanan Adler from Yeshiva University, one of the Rebbeim there, has a beautiful, beautiful Haggadah, not translated to English yet, called Asher Hanan. And he points out that the Halach Ma'ani is right before Manishtana, not just because it's the beginning of the Seder, but because we say Hashata Hacha Lishana Haba'ah. We talk about the Shana, the next year, but the word Shana has a connotation also like the word Shinui, of changes. And therefore, next thing we say is the Ma Nishtana, right? What is different? How this night is different. Ma Nishtana Halayla Hazeh. And before we say how different this night, ringing in our ears that a second ago, we just said Hashana Lishana Haba'ah. In the next year, there could be a change. Understand? Sort of phonetic, the juxtaposition, the two things is that Yishtaneh Matzav Shel Achshav, and maybe we'll be redeemed and we'll be free by next year from whatever it is that we're the subjugations we experience now. Manishtana. So Manishtana Halayla Hazeh. Again, a song. It's the next song. I'm going in order of the songs. You see what I'm saying? So Manishtana. So Davka, of course, halachically, you're supposed to start Derech She'elu Tshuva. The entire Seder should be questions and answers. Later, people would refer to this as Socratic method, right? But according to our tradition, this is how it always was. And you should just consider those questions. And the Abarbanel in his Haggadah writes that the questions are really about contradictions or tensions, now things that we don't recognize from things that have come before, right? So the contradiction, though, is not just the contradiction like we used to do that, now we're doing this. It's something else. It's that when I talk about 4 cups, I don't have to ask the question about, I usually have 1 cup and now it's 4 cups. Why is that not a question? Isn't that new? It's novel. Saying a bracha, right? So he says, no, the Daled Kosod, it represents, you tell a child, no, it represents the Daled Lashon of Gula, the four phases of redemption. It's about a certain progression in Jewish history. The contradictions we're talking about here are that 2 of these questions, right, the matzah and the maror, reflect servitude and sadness in some way, oppression. But the latter 2, the dipping and the leaning, are all about freedom. The question of Manishtana is a question on a certain level of how are these things living together? How do we integrate the first 2 questions and the last 2 questions? Understand? One is that questions we ask from poverty, and the other ones are the questions we ask from wealth. That could be economic poverty and wealth, could be spiritual poverty and wealth. How do you live with both of these themes at the same time? The answer, sort of right there, Avadim Hayinu L'Farav Mitzrayim. They both live, they do live side by side. And part of what we're going to do tonight is to move from a Seder of denigration to a Seder of praise. It's not just a rah-rah about we got out, we're free, the taste of liberty is sweet. You have to start by understanding the backdrop of what that servitude represents, even though we might have emerged from it. Okay, I gave you here a sheet you don't have, apparently. The Mishnah does tell us, Kana ben Shoel Aviv, right? Here the son should ask his father questions. If the son doesn't know, the father should teach him. Vim ein dat beben aviv malamdo. And what's the teaching? The father says to the child, here are the questions. It's not entirely clear that the child's supposed to ask those questions. It could be read, and some do read it in the house of Brisk. This is how they understood it. A child should ask a question. Whatever the question, if you don't have any questions and you're stuck, let's get you started. Here's some cue cards. Why don't you just read off these boilerplate questions? But really, the questions are supposed to be asked, whatever the questions are. That's why we have so many traditions with, right? So the child should ask a question. The Rashbam, sounds like he's saying, that based on what you have in the Gemara in Pesachim and Kuf Ted Vav, if someone were to ask a question, there is a line in the Gemara. It says, Patarta milomar manishtana. We don't have to say manishtana now. We only say that when we don't have someone asking a question. If you ask a question, we're all good. You could say that at your Seder and just pause, the long, dramatic, awkward pause. And a cynical person will already have their questions. And it's also a question. When do we eat? Good question. Excellent. You're engaged. Love it. Yeah. So, okay. So, that's just, it's basic, right? Rav Yossi Misalant says that the Manishtana here is really about the fact that Hashem changed Teva in order to save us. There was a change in the natural order. Slaves never got out of Egypt. Slaves is considered like the greatest open air prison, actual open air prison, not like the calumnies people raise against the Jews. But that was the reality of what it was, and yet the Jews got out. That's a change in nature. The 10 plagues, change in nature. The drowning at the sea of the enemy, that's a change in nature. So we make changes at our Seder to show that if God could change nature, we'll also change our nature, and that will therefore become almost prayerful. We're hoping that Kadosh Baruch Hu will make more changes in nature, i.e., to redeem us in their Gedula Shlema. So a means of being Model Hashem, we're being Mefarsem, we're publicizing changes. How do you publicize it? Well, here are the things we're doing. Why are we doing so many different things? Because Hashem did different things for us. We wouldn't have gotten out. That we got out, how we got out, all of that, shinuyim.
What was the source of the idea that somebody asks questions, you can skip the 4 questions?
The Gemara in the Mishnah and Psachim on page 116a. But there's already a little vignette on the previous page, 115b, in Psachim, where someone asks a question, and the response is, okay, now we don't have to say manishtana. The Lashon is, patartin milor manishtana. We no longer have to say the manishtana. How come? Because you asked the question. Then manishtana is like boilerplate. And you read the Mishnah, it sounds that way. It sounds that way. The way the Mishnah says, the kan mazgulo kos sheni means you pour the second cup, which was not really just the act of pouring, but the balancing of the wine with water, because their wine is very pungent. So they're balancing it. V'kan haben shoel aviv. Here, the son asks his father. V'imein dat baben aviv malamdo. If the son has no intelligence, so then his father will teach him. Colon. Manishtana halayla azemi kolay and it lists them off. That's how it goes. Now, speaking of listing it off, just for consideration, the truth is that the way it's written in the Mishnah, we have 4 questions: matzah, maror, roasted food, specifically korban pesach, and dipping. Those are the 4 in the Mishnah. Doesn't mention about leaning; it's not there. If you consider why that might be, it's pretty obvious. We don't actually have a korban pesach, so the question is gone. So the question could be asked: how come we don't do the same question that we used to do when we had the Mishnah? The answer is because we don't korban pesach. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. So there are 5 questions. No, in the Mishnah there are only 4 that are listed. In the Rambam, the truth is in Hilchot Chametz U'Matzah in Halacha Bet, he actually, again, I have the source here. So he actually does have the 5 questions. He lists all 5. And he seems to think you're gonna say that as well in the Manishtana. The Rambam does something very interesting. He has a Haggadah, the Rambam, like what he says we should say, but he also has in his code in the Mishnah Torah, he has Hilchot Chametz U'Matzah, which at certain points in the halachas, he's giving you the story of the Seder in its ideal form with the eating of the korban pesach, so it's like integrated into it. And then at one point there's like a switch, and he says, "Okay, but today we don't have the korban pesach." And so when you're reading earlier on in this particular section, Chametz U'Matzah Perek Chet Halacha Bet, he quotes 5 questions, including Haseba. So he didn't have it's not in the Mishnah. He put it in, and then after he has the 5, then Halacha Gimel he says, "Bizman hazeh eino omer v'halayla hazeh kulo tzli she'ein lanu korban." You don't say that one anymore. We don't have a korban nowadays. Bizman hazeh nowadays, but he thinks in the ideal there should be 5 questions, including the one about Haseba. Now we're down to 4 questions because it's not a replacement, but it's taking one away because we don't have it. Okay. In the name of the Vilna Gaon, they say that actually in the time of the Gemara there really was no question about Haseba. It wasn't a shinui. Everybody ate that way. It's really like a I think the Ashkenazis say it's a gulistic question because there's nothing strange about leaning. Beino shvinu vein mesube. No, in the olden days, everybody leaned. That's how people ate, on a couch of some sort, a chaise lounge. I don't know if it's really accurate historically by what we know in outside sources, but Vilna Gaon said it, though he lived in the 18th century. Kedai lismoch alav, you can rely on him. Because the question is, why isn't it in the Mishnah? Yeah, it is a good question. I was sitting there. Must be in the olden days they didn't eat that way. Certainly not at a feast. Certainly not at a feast. Okay. Next song, at least in my house, the next song is Baruch Hamakom Baruch Hu. Yeah. Okay. So there's one other song, but I skipped it because it's not actually accurate to the Haggadah. So it's not. Never mind. This is like a family thing. So Baruch Hamakom, the Shibbolei Haleket writes. So also one of the Rishonim. He writes that in the middle of the Seder we have to say what amounts to Birchat HaTorah. Birchat HaTorah. We're about to start reading psukim, verses, and we're going to expound the verses. So Chacham, what does the Chacham say? Colon, and it's quoting a verse. That's in the Torah. There's a verse. Yeah. Rashi Ma'omer, Ma'avodal Zolachem. Oh, that's also in the Torah, right? The Tom is going to ask Mazal. So before we're going to invoke psukim, we're going to have a modified bracha on learning Torah. There's a bracha that we're meant to say every single morning, and it's in the Siddur, printed in the Siddur, called Birchot Torah, as is well known. Exactly. So that's the question. It covers the whole day. So what do you have to make in a Birchot Torah? Right. So therefore, you're not going to say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. You say Baruch Hamakom Baruch Hu Baruch Shenatan Torah L'Amo Yisrael Baruch Hu. It's still a beautiful idea, but of course, it still begs the question: if I pull out a Chumash, a Gemara, a Rambam at my Shabbos table, I have to say Birchot Torah. You don't have to do that. I mean, we're going to have Dvar Torah now at dinner for my Shabbos table. Let me just say Birchot Torah quickly. Yeah. Okay, but what's going on? We're praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we have a guidebook through this whole process, which is the Torah. It's the template. Everything is built around it. So once we're going to expound these psukim, we're not expounding them as a historical source, because we really want a historical source. And when I call the Torah a historical source, come the night of the Seder, open up the book of Shmot, at the beginning, Ve'el Shmot Bnei Yisrael, by Mitzrayim, and read the story. Moshe's going to basket, the whole thing, but the whole business. None of that's there. Why isn't it there? There are a lot of different answers given. But one of the elements here is we're telling the story. We're not reading a story. We're telling a story. So now we're going to take the psukim, even the verses that we're going to be reading. They're there, the questions of each of the sons, but we're integrating them with the oral tradition. How's that? We're saying it's not, there's a question. Your son will ask you tomorrow, what are the edicts and the statutes, etc. But rather, this is the chacham. We're telling you some new information about how to understand this question, because the questions are in various places in the Torah, right? So it's, in other words, it's an organizing principle. And therefore, we're affirming God gave the Torah, written Torah, and the point is the oral Torah that goes with the written Torah. And we only need to amplify that when we're actually going to read psukim. Verses are going to be read aloud. And so this idea that, it's a Birchot Torah. The Shibbolei Haleket, the Rokeach says that as well. The Ram says that as well. But there's another beautiful idea, which is, why are we using that name of God, Hamakom, Baruch Hamakom? Yeah, call God Hamakom, like Hamakom Yinachem Etchem, or something like that. So the Shibbolei Haleket points out, because we refer to God, the Chachamim say in the Medrash, as a Medrash likes to have that on page 3. Actually, it's I think the second source on page 3, right, where it says Vayivga b'makom. Yaakov encountered the place, right? He arrived at the place, but it doesn't mean the place. It's a stand-in. It's a double entendre. It really means Hashem. But so the Medrash says, Rav Huna v'shem Rabbi Ami, Amad, second source, page 3. Mipnei ma mechanin shmosh l'kodesh baruch hu v'kor natom makom. Why do we use this kinoi, this appellation for God's name, as the place? In English, very clumsily translated as the omnipresent one, right? How come? Shehu makomo sha'olam ve'ena olam makomo. God is the place of the world. The world is not. God is not within the world, but the world is, in a certain sense, held up by the Ribbono Shel Olam. He is the place of the world. The world is situated, as it were, within God. This is a very complicated topic, and maybe too much for a Seder, maybe too much even for this morning, if you had enough coffee. But obviously, God made space for there to be a world that is not coterminous with God. In other words, the Ribbono Shel Olam is everywhere, but he is not the objects of the world. The Bore, the creator, and the Bria, the creation, are separated one from the other. There is a distinction between them. However, the sustenance, the ability of creation to continue to exist, continues to exist because God, as it were, in quotation marks, holds up the world. God is the life force, it gives life as the life force, the sum of the life force, the cheolamim, to all of the worlds and all of the stratum within each world. Great in terms of size and infinitesimal and everything in between. So Baruch Hamakom, this is an affirmation. The Ribono Shel Olam is the place of the world. He's holding up all of creation, as it were. And this idea, the idea of all of creation having this backdrop. You have this line from the Vilna Gaon. He says, what does it mean? Baruch Hamakom Baruch Hu. Baruch Shnatan Shalom Yisrael Baruch Hu. You hear the repetition Baruch Hu at the end of each? So the first one, Baruch Hamakom, refers to the first time the world was renewed. It was created. That's a creation. And God's holding up the creation. How? He's God. I don't know. I have no idea how he does it. That's what he does. I have no insight into it. And yet I'm going to say, Baruch Hu. Blessed is God. But then I'll say, Baruch Shenatan Torah L'Mo Yisrael. On that one, I have a lot of insight. What's the insight? I have the guidebook. I understand that God creating the world, he actually gave us a Torah. It's explicated. We have it right there. The Gra goes a step further. He says that Baruch Hamakom, we understand there's a world around us, and we affirm God is holding up the world. Okay, he's the Bore. And by the by, Baruch Hu, we're thanking God for actually having had the machshava, the thought to create the world. The machshava comes first, sof ma'aseh, the machshava tchila. We can't even mention God's name because there's an element of the ineffability of God's name. Means we can't even explicate, speak the truth about God. What do we know? So it's beyond our understanding. We know that kind of hardware. So Baruch Hu, blessed is He. Whatever Hashem is, we don't understand. He decided to make the world. Why? Baruch Hu, he did it. That's the machshava. And the Maisa is the makom that there is something called space, but we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is holding up, as it were, the ability for space to exist as something corporeal. Secondly, Baruch Shenatan Torah L'Mo Yisrael, that's about Matan Torah. It's almost like a recreation of the world because now there's a guidebook to how to you live in the world. We have 1 minute left, so I'll telegraph the end point here. Baruch Hu, on the thought, the expression of Sof Masim Machshava Tchila. We understand where is a person, right? The thoughts came first. Whatever is manifest, the thought came before it, and that's as we go into the four sons. The Rokeach has this beautiful idea, right? Baruch Hamakom, and also you have this in the Netziv, in the Imre Shefer. What does the Netziv write? It's just so beautiful. Baruch Hamakom. That's the Chacham understands because the Chacham is so connected to God. He can refer to God as Hamakom, but the Rasha is so disconnected. Calls God He. Baruch Hu. The Tam. Simple. I don't know about all these cosmic ideas with the Makom or this, that. I just know there's a Torah and I have to follow, have to learn it. That's the Ben Atam. Baruch Shan Tolom Yisrael. And then what's the following of Baruch Hu? Like the Ben Arasha, Shena Daily Show. Doesn't even have a question. The first and the third on this list are somehow interested in connecting, already connected in some way. They can articulate a positive question. But the second and the fourth, there's some ambivalence, some gap that's there that they have. There's maybe some resistance. In the case of the Rasha, in the case of the Shena Shol, and you see the parallel. Actually, the answer given to both is both the words v'higadeta levincha v'yomahu lemor ba'avu zeh Hashem li b'tzeitim mitzrayim. It's the same sentence actually for the Rasha as is for the Shena Shol. And for one, you're telling the story in a positive way. They just don't know how to ask. The other one, you're highlighting Asa Hashem li. I got out, me, but not you. It's going to goad, try to get them into conversation. You could say, yeah. Okay. V'hisha Amda, I gave a Shabbos Agadol drasha about it a few years ago, so there's always a lot to say. V'hisha Amda, what is this V'hisha Amda? It's another song at the Seder. V'hisha Amda Lavatenu V'lanu. So the Shibbolei Alek, it quotes from his brother, Rabbi Binyamin, Ben Tzidki Arofe. What does he say? The promise of redemption that God gave to Avram Avinu and Brit Ben Betarim. He showed him the slavery, and he gave him a promise. And the promise is we're going to get out of it. And the promise is there'll be a redemption. He sha'amda lavotenu, havtacha sha'amda lavotenu. Vihi means the promise that held up for our forefathers in Egypt and in Bavel and in Media and in Greece and is still now in the Galut Edom, as it's called, the Roman exile. We know this to be true, and so we say Vihi sha'amda lavotenu. The promise is what stays for us throughout Jewish history. Yeah. Okay. All right. A lot more to say. I better stop here because I overstayed my welcome. It's after 10:45. I'm just trying to hold to the time. People have things to do and places to go. So this is just the beginning. I couldn't. I think Tzvika asked me before. Oh, you're gonna get to Chad Gadya? No, not the first session. But if time will permit, I'll do another session. We'll start after Hisha. I'm gonna do some of the other songs. Divrei Torah and different things. And you have 2 nights. You'll spread it between them all. That's it for tonight. For today. I wish you a great day. Chag Chashav Sameach. Good things. We always need more. What am I going to do? We have to need more. Yeah.